Complete list of Loeb titles can be found at the end of each volume. Diodorus Siculus, Greek historian of Egerium and Sicily, CE 80 BC 20. BCE wrote 40 books of world history called Library of History in 3 parts. Mythical history of peoples, non-Greek and Greek, to the Trojan War, history to Alexander's death, 323 BC, history to 54b. Of this we have books Ive, Bactrians, Assyrians, Ethiopians, Greeks, books, XVIII, Greek history, 480 BC, 302 BC, and fragments of the rest. He was an uncritical compiler, but used good sources and reproduced them faithfully. He is valuable for details unrecorded elsewhere, and as evidence for works now lost, especially the writing of Ephorus, Apollodorus, Apollodorus, Agatharchides, Philistus, and Timaeus. Diodorus of Sicily in 12 volumes, XCI fragments of books, XXXII, Exel with an English translation by Francis, Walton, Gennadius Library, Athens with a general index to Diodorus by Russel M. Geer, Emeritus Professor of Alassical Languages, Tulane University, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, London, William Heinemann, Lolt McMox vi Hall. Introduction. In the introduction to volume XCEP, I noted that the text of the Photius fragments of Diodorus should, ideally, have been based on a collation of the 2 primary manuscripts of the Bibliotheca, A and M in 450 and 450, one of which Becker knew only the former. In 1959, a new edition of the Bibliotheca, a Longfeet need, began to appear in the Budi series, collection Byzantine, edited and translated by René Henry. The work is now halfway to completion, and in due course we may expect to have a definitive text of the learned patriarch's extracts from Diodorus. Meanwhile, Professor Henry has generously provided me with his collation of the manuscripts. Since my text was already prepared and in proof since 1957, it was not, unfortunately, possible to make direct use of this material. I have, however, recorded in the addenda and corrigenda a certain number of readings that seem to be of particular importance or interest. My particular thanks are due also to Mr. B. Panayotopoulos and to Professor E. Gaba for their help in reading and interpreting an Athos manuscript of John of Antioch. This late but interesting document, which I have discussed at some length in Historia, 1965, 1965, 236,251, provides a new text for B. Key 30.8.9.5 and a new, if dubious, fragmentum sedis incertum, no, 15. V. Nen none. Professor Frank J. Frost kindly called to my attention what appeared to be a new fragment of Diodorus in a scholion on Gregorius Nazianzenus, Piccolomini Annali del Università Toscani, XVP 232. A discussion of the obolos and other monetary units. It is specifically ascribed to Diodorus of Sicily. In fact, it is almost certainly by a later Diodorus, the author of the Per Stathmon, Ep Suidas, Sidas, SV Talentum. Though irrelevant to our present concern, I record its elimination to spare some future editor. Francis R. Watron Atwins, May 1966, VAD, The Library of History of Diodorus of Sicily, Fragments of Books, XXXII Ixel Vol. XVIII. The Library of History of Diodorus of Sicily, Fragments of Book XXXII 1. The Lusitanians, says Diodorus, were at first, for lack of any adequate leader, an easy prey in their war with Rome, but later, after they found Viriathus, inflicted heavy losses on the Romans. This Viriathus was one of the Lusitanians who dwell near the ocean, and having been a shepherd from boyhood was a practiced mountaineer. To this mode of life, indeed, his physical endowment well suited him, since in strength of arm, in speed of foot, and in agility and nimbleness generally, he was far superior to the other Iberians. Having accustomed himself to a regime of little food, much exercise, and a bare minimum of sleep, and in short, by living at all times under arms and in constant conflict with beasts of the wild and with brigands, he had made his name a byword with the populace, was chosen to be their leader, and in a short while gathered about him a band of freebooters. By his success on the battlefield, he not only won acclaim as a warrior, but gained besides a reputation for exceptional qualities of leadership. He was, moreover, scrupulous in the division of spoils, and according to their deserts honored with gifts those of his men who distinguished themselves for bravery. As time went on, he proclaimed himself chieftain, a brigand no more, and taking up arms against the Romans, he defeated them in many battles. The Roman general Vitellius, for 147 pio. Example, he utterly crushed, with all his army, and taking the general himself captive, put him to death by the sword. He won many military successes besides, until Fabius was chosen to take charge of 145 pio, the war against him. Thereupon his fortunes began to decline in no small measure. Then, rallying, he won new laurels at the expense of Fabius, and forced him to subscribe to a treaty unworthy of the Romans. But Capio, on being picked to command the forces opposing Viriathus, annulled the treaty, and after first inflicting repeated reverses on Viriathus and then bringing him to utter defeat, so that he even sought a truce, got him assassinated by the man's own kinsman. Then, having cowed Totimus, who succeeded to the command and his army, and having arranged a treaty such as he wished to impose, he granted them land and a city in which to dwell. Viriathus, the Lusitanian robber captain, was scrupulous in the division of spoils. He based his rewards on merit, making special gifts to those of his men who distinguished themselves for bravery, and took for his own use not one thing belonging to the common store. In consequence, the Lusitanians followed him wholeheartedly into battle, and honored him as their common benefactor and savior. 2. In his provincial governorship, Plautius, the Roman praetor, proved to be a poor leader. Found guilty on his return home on charges of minuta majestas, he left Rome and went into exile. 3. In Syria, King Alexander, whose weakness of character rendered him incompetent to govern a kingdom, had turned over the administration of Antioch to Hierax and Diodorus. 4. Demetrius, now that the royal power of Egypt had been shattered and he alone was left, assumed that he was quit of all danger. Scorning, therefore, to ingratiate himself with the populace as was customary, and waxing ever more burdensome in his demands upon them, he sank into ways of despotic brutality and extravagantly lawless behavior of every sort. Now the responsibility for his disposition lay not only in his nature, but also with the man who was set over the kingdom. For he, being an impious knave, was the author of all these evils, since he flattered the youth and prompted him to deeds of utter infamy. In the first instance, Demetrius chastened those who had been hostile to him in the war, not with mild censure, but visited them with outlandish punishment. Then, when the citizens of Antioch behaved towards him in their usual fashion, he arrayed against them a considerable body of mercenary troops and stripped the citizens of their arms. Those who did not choose to hand them over, he either slew in open combat or cut down, together with their wives and children, in their own homes. And when serious riots broke out over the disarming, he set fire to the greater part of the city. After punishing many of those implicated, he confiscated their property to the royal purse. Many Antiochians, in fear and hatred, fled the city and wandered all about Syria, biding their time to attack the king. Demetrius, now their avowed enemy, never ceased to murder, banish, and rob, and even outdid his father in harshness and thirst for blood. For in fact, his father, who had affected not a kingly equity, but a tyrant's lawlessness, had involved his subjects in irremediable misfortunes, with the consequence that the kings of this house were hated for their transgressions, and those of the other house were loved for their equity. Hence, at any moment, there were struggles and continual wars in Syria, as the princes of each house constantly lay in wait for one another. The populace, in fact, welcomed the dynastic changes, since each king, on being restored, sought their favor. 4. A certain Diodorus, also called Tryphon, who stood high in esteem among the king's friends, perceiving the excitement of the masses and their hatred for the prince, revolted from Demetrius, and soon finding large numbers ready to join him, enlisted, first, the men of Larissa, who were renowned for their courage, and had indeed received their present habitation as a reward of valor, for they were colonists from the Sicilian Larissa, and as loyal allies to the royal line descended from Seleucus Nicator, had always fought in the front ranks of the cavalry. He also made an ally of the Arab Sheikh Iamblichus, who happened to have in his keeping Antiochus, siled Epiphanes, a mere child, the son of Alexander. Setting a diadem on his head and providing him with the retinue appropriate to a king, he restored the child to his father's throne. Or he supposed, as was only natural, that the populace, eager for a change, would welcome him home because of the equity of the kings of this house, and because of the lawlessness of the present ruler. Having collected a modest host, he first encamped around Chalcis, a city situated on the Arabian border and capable of supporting an army quartered there and assuring its safety. With this as his base, he brought over the neighboring regions and accumulated the supplies needed for war. Demetrius at first made light of him as a mere brigand and ordered his soldiers to arrest the man, but later, when Tryphon had built up an army of unexpected size and taken as a pretext for his own venture the restoration of the boy to his kingdom, Demetrius resolved to dispatch a general against him. 5. The inhabitants of Aradus thought that the moment had come to destroy the city of Marathus. Sending secretly therefore to Ammonius, the prime minister of the realm, they persuaded him by a gift of 300 talents to betray Marathus to them. He sent Isidorus to Marathus, ostensibly on some other business, in reality to seize the city and hand it over to the Aradians. But the Marathines, ignorant of the doom pronounced against them and aware that the Aradians stood high in favor with the king, resolved not to admit into the city the soldiers sent by the king, and instead to appeal personally for help from Aradus. Accordingly, they at once selected 10 of their oldest citizens, men of the highest distinction, and sent them to Aradus bearing branches of supplication, and carrying with them the most ancient of the city's idols, hoping, by an appeal to the ties of kinship and to reverence for the gods, to effect a complete change in the attitude of the Aradians. The emissaries, following instructions, disembarked from their ship and addressed their appeals and supplications to the populace. The Aradians, keyed to a frenzy, paid no heed to the laws everywhere observed with respect to suppliance, and counted as naught the reverence due to the images and gods of a kindred people. So, dashing to pieces the divine images, they wantonly trampled them underfoot and attempted to stone the envoys to death. But when a few elderly men intervened to check the excited mob, the crowd reluctantly, and in deference to the elders, stopped throwing stones, but bade them lead the envoys off to prison. The Aradians, keyed to a frenzy, showed no respect for the envoys, and when the hapless emissaries in protest invoked the sacred rights of suppliants and the inviolability assured to envoys, the most reckless of the young men in a fury ran them through. As soon as the unholy slaughter was ended, they rushed to the assembly, and compounding their offences contrived yet another impious plot against the Marathines. Stripping the dead men of their rings, they sent a letter to the people of Marathus, ostensibly from the ambassadors, in which they informed them that the Aradians promised to send soldiers to their aid, hoping that, if the Marathines believed that they had, in truth, allies on the way, their soldiers would be admitted to the city. They were not, however, able to carry through their wicked design, since a God-fearing and upright man took pity on their fate even as they were about to be utterly ruined, though the Aradians had removed all boats, so that no one should be able to reveal to the intended victims the intrigue aimed at them. A certain seaman, well disposed towards the Marathines and accustomed to ply the waterways thereabouts, swam by night across the strait, for his own bark had been taken away, safely accomplished the perilous mile-long crossing, and revealed to the Marathines the plot against them. And when the Aradians learned through spies that their project had been made known, they gave up the villainous scheme of the letters. 5. In Pisidia there was a man named Molechestes, a native of Bobo. He stood first in esteem among all in those parts, and because of his prominence was chosen general. As his power grew, he obtained bodyguards and then openly proclaimed himself tyrant. After a certain time his brother, Simmias, who sought to transfer the power to himself and who was trusted as a brother would be, slew Mocheltes and succeeded to his position. The sons of the murdered man, who at the time were still in their teens, were secretly taken by a kinsman to Termessus. There they were reared, and on reaching full manhood, set out to avenge their father's murder. But after slaying the tyrant, they elected not to assume power themselves, but restored their country's popular government. 6. Ptolemy, the brother of Ptolemy Philometor, on becoming king, began his administration of the realm with flagrant breaches of the law. There were many persons, for example, whom he ensnared on false charges of plotting against him and cruelly and illegally put to death. Others he falsely charged with crime on various counts, and driving them into exile confiscated their property. As these acts provoked dissatisfaction and resentment, he brought upon himself the wrath of the entire populace and soon became an object of hatred to his subjects. Nonetheless, he ruled for 15 years. 6. Diodorus says that the younger Ptolemy, succeeding his elder brother, ruled for 15 years and committed many lawless acts. He married his own sister, Cleopatra, falsely accused many of plotting against him, and putting some to death, drove others into exile by his charges and seized their property. 7. Viriathus, when many gold and silver cups and all sorts of broidered robes had been set out for his wedding, supporting himself on his lance, regarded the lavish display with no sign of admiration or wonder, but showed rather a feeling of disdain. He also, in a single remark, spoke volumes of good sense, and he let fall many statements about ingratitude towards benefactors and about folly, at being puffed up over the unstable gifts of Fortunes. Above all, that the muck-touted wealth of his father-in-law was itself subject to the man who held the spear. Further, that he owed him a greater debt than others, yet offered him, the true master of it all, no personal gift. Viriathus, therefore, neither bathed nor took his place at table, though importuned to do so, but when a table with viands of all sorts was set before him, he took bread and meat and gave it to those who had made the journey with him. Then, after casually too taking a few morsels himself, he ordered them to fetch the bride. Having offered sacrifice and performed the rites customary among the Iberians, he set the maiden on his mare and rode off at once to the place he had in readiness in the mountains. For he considered self-sufficiency his greatest wealth, freedom his country, and the eminence won by bravery his securest possession. He was a man who, in conversation too, went straight to the mark, since the words he uttered were the faultless outpouring of an untutored and unspoilt nature. When many costly objects had been set out for his wedding, Viriathus, having looked his fill, said to Astolpas, "How is it, pray, that the Romans who saw all this at your banquets kept their hands off such valuables, though it was in their power to wrest them from you?" When Astolpas replied that no one had ever moved to seize or ask for them, though many knew of their existence, he said, "Then why in the world, man, if the authorities granted you immunity and the secure enjoyment of these things, did you desert them and choose to ally yourself with my nomadic life and my humble company, as this was indeed a man who in conversation went straight to the mark, since his words flowed from an untutored and unspoilt nature? So, for example, apropos of the people of Tucker, who never stuck to the same course, but went over now to the Romans, now to him, and often repeated these moves, he told a story that subtly rallied and at the same time rebuked their uncertainty of purpose. There was, he said, a certain middle-aged man who took 2 wives. The younger, eager to have her husband resemble her, pulled out his grey hairs, while the old woman pulled out the black ones, until between them he was soon left quite bald. A similar fate, he said, would be in store for the people of Tuscia, for as the Romans put to death those who were at odds with them, and the Lusitanians did away with their enemies, the city would soon be left empty. He is said to have made many other pithy remarks as well, for though he had had no formal education, he was schooled in the understanding of practical affairs. For the speech of one who lives according to nature is concise, being a byproduct of virtuous pursuits, and when a thing is stated simply, briefly, and without frills, the speaker is credited with a pointed saying, while the hearer has something to remember. 8. Weakness and a lowly status in life foster a frugal self-sufficiency and honesty, but a lofty estate goes hand in hand with self-aggrandizement and a disregard for law that is rooted in dishonesty. 9. Demetrius, during his stay at Laodicea, spent his time idly, giving drinking parties and lavishly indulging in the most costly pleasures. So, too, his public conduct remained unchanged, in that he continued to commit random outrages on many persons and was incapable of profiting by his reverses to mend his way. 10. The men of Kossos clung stubbornly to their primacy. What prompted them to ambitions of leadership was the ancient repute of their city and the widespread fame of their ancestors in the heroic age. For Zeus, as some tell the tale, was reared among them, and Minos the sea lord, who was a Causian, was educated by Zeus, and far surpassed all other men in valiancy. 11. In keeping with the tale told about Agamemnon, how he laid a curse on the soldiers left behind in Crete, there is still current among the Cretans an ancient proverb, which in a single verse prophesies the unexpected disaster that now took place. Alas, the men of Pergamus were heedless of ruin. The Egyptian populace cherished a deep hatred for Ptolemy because of his brutality towards his subjects and his lawless conduct. For when his character was considered side by side with that of Philometor, it did not even admit of comparison, since each of the two went to an extreme, the one of equity, the other of bloodthirsty brutality. Therefore, the populace was ripe for a change and awaited the proper moment to revolt. 13. While Ptolemy was being enthroned in his palace at Memphis in accordance with Egyptian custom, Cleopatra bore the king a son. Exceedingly pleased, he surnamed the child Memphites, after the city in which he was performing sacrifice when the child was born. During the birth festival, indulging his usual thirst for blood, he ordered the execution of the Cyrenians who had accompanied him on his return to Egypt, but were now under accusation for certain frank and honest statements because of his concubine, Irene. 14. When Diogenes, the king of the Thracians, ascended the throne and the tide of fortune was flowing in his favor beyond all expectations, he ceased to govern his subjects as friends and comrades in arms, but lorded it over them harshly as if they were bought slaves or captive foes. Many were the fine, noble Thracians he tortured and put to death, and many were the victims of his abusive treatment and unbridled violence. There was no woman, no boy whose beauty he left intact, no rich store of possessions that was left undiminished. The whole realm was full of his lawlessness. He ravaged also the Greek cities along his borders, and the captives were subjected to his outrages or punished with terrible and exquisite tortures. Becoming master of Lysimachia, a city subject to Attalus, he set the city afire, and picking out the most prominent of the captives, visited them with peculiar and outlandish punishments. He would, for example, cut off the hands and feet and heads of children and hang them about their parents' necks to wear, or cut off the parts of husbands and wives and exchange them. At times, after lopping off his victims' hands, he would split them down the spine, and on occasion would even carry the hewn halves on the points of spears, whereby he surpassed in cruelty Phalaris and the tyrant of Cassandreia, Apollodorus. Even leaving out of account all the rest of his bloodthirstiness, one could judge of his surpassing cruelty by the single instance now to be related. In the course of celebrating his marriage, according to ancient Thracian usage, he seized 2 young travelers, Greeks from the kingdom of Attalus, a pair of brothers, both strikingly handsome, one with the first down sprouting on his cheeks, the other just acquiring a suggestion of this bloom. Having garlanded them both like sacrificial victims, he brought them in, and when he had had his attendants stretch out the younger at full length, as if to split him down the middle, he exclaimed that it was not right for kings and commoners to use the same kind of victims. When the older youth wailed, displaying a brotherly affection, and threw himself beneath the axe, the king ordered the attendants to stretch him out as well. His cruelty then redoubled. He aimed a single blow at each, and both times drove it home, while the spectators raised the paean to signal his success. And many other crimes as well did he commit. 15. Attalus, hearing how Diogenes was hated by his subjects because of his rapacity and his extreme cruelty, affected a policy that was just the opposite. Accordingly, by treating the Thracians who were taken captive with humanity and setting them free, he enlisted many voices to proclaim his mercy. Diogenes, on learning of this, inflicted terrible outrages and cruel tortures on the hostages left by any who absconded, among them children of very tender years and delicate constitution, for even these were torn limb from limb by every possible means, or had their heads, hands, and feet chopped off. Some of them were impaled on stakes, others exposed on trees. Women, and not a few only, were to be seen with bodies spread-eagled and offered for outrage in addition to the fate of death, being made to assume every shameful position that the arrogance of barbarians could suggest. Thus, the victims were presented to their violators as the demonstration of a shameless savagery, but provoked many who were onlookers with a capacity for civilized reflection to feelings of pity for the hapless creatures. 16. When Numantia and Temessus sent envoys to the Romans to discuss the cessation of hostilities, the Romans granted them peace. On the following terms, each city was to surrender to the Romans 300 hostages, 9,000 cloaks, 3,000 hides, 800 war horses, and all their arms. This done, they would be friends and allies. A day having been set for the cities to comply, they duly fulfilled all the terms of the agreement. But when last of all they were required to surrender their arms, there was an outburst of noble lamentation as a frenzy of independence swept over the crowd. It was an outrage, they complained to one another, if they were to strip themselves of arms like so many women. Repenting of their decision, they engaged in mutual reproaches, and fathers accused sons, children, their parents, wives, their husbands. Reverting, therefore, to their original disposition and refusing to give up their arms, they renewed the conflict with the Romans. 17. When Pompeius advanced against the city called Lagni and laid it under siege, the Numantians, wishing to succor their countrymen, sent 400 soldiers under cover of night. The inhabitants, welcoming them with delight, called them saviors and honored them with gifts. A few days later, however, overcome with fear, they offered to yield the city and sought assurances of safety for their person. Now when Pompeius replied that he would not make terms with them unless they first surrendered their allies, they at first held out, scrupling to wrong their benefactor. But as the situation grew desperate, they resumed negotiations and attempted to secure their own safety by the destruction of their friend. Their resolve did not, however, pass unnoticed by the intended victims, who, on learning what was afoot, prepared to defend themselves, and attacking the townsmen by night, spilled much blood. Pompeius, hearing the din, set ladders to the walls and seized the city. All the nobles he slaughtered, but he released from jeopardy the allies, 200 in number, partly out of pity for their imperiled valor and for the mischance that had befallen these victims of ingratitude, and partly as a means of soliciting at long range the goodwill of the Numantians for the Romans. The city he razed to the ground. 18. King Arsaces, by pursuing a set policy of clemency and humanity, won an automatic stream of advantages and further enlarged his kingdom, for he extended his power even to India, and without a battle brought under his sway the region once ruled by Porus. But, though raised to such heights of royal power, he did not cultivate luxury or arrogance, the usual accompaniments of power, but prided himself on the exercise of equity towards those who accepted his rule and courage towards those who opposed him. In short, having made himself master over many peoples, he taught the Parthians the best of the customs practiced by each. 19. When Viriathus requested an interview, the consul Popilius decided to state one by one the Roman demands, for fear that if they were mentioned all at once, in desperation and fury, he would be driven to implacable hostility. 20. A certain Galoestes, an Athemanian by birth and son of Aminander, the former king of the Athemanians, was a man far superior to his countrymen in birth, wealth, and renown. He became the friend of Ptolemy Philometor, and in the struggle against Demetrius had served as commander of the Alexandrian forces. Now, after the defeat and death of Ptolemy, false charges were levelled against him, that he had willfully betrayed the Egyptian cause to the enemy, and when the Ptolemii who inherited the kingdom stripped him of his estates and showed himself ill-disposed towards him, he took fright and departed for Greece. As many others besides were being banished from Egypt because of the strife with the mercenary troops, he made the exiles welcome. Claiming that King Ptolemy Philometor had entrusted to him a son by Cleopatra to be reared as heir to the kingdom, he placed a diadem on the boy's head, and with a number of exiles as partisans of the cause made ready to restore him to his father's kingdom. 21. Orders, Ditalces, and Nicarontes, men of the city of Orso, all three close kinsmen and friends, observing that Viriathus's prestige was suffering under the Roman blows and apprehensive on their own score, decided to establish some claim to favor with the Romans as a means of ensuring their personal safety. Seeing that Viriathus was eager to bring the war to an end, they promised to persuade Caepio to make peace if Viriathus would send them as envoys to arrange a cessation of hostilities. When the chieftain gave his ready assent, they hastened to Caepio and easily persuaded him to grant them assurances of safety on their promise to assassinate Viriathus. After an exchange of pledges, they quickly returned to the camp and asserting that they had won the consent of the Romans to the peace aroused Viriathus to high hopes, while they were eager to distract his mind as far as possible from any suspicion of the truth. Since they were trusted by virtue of their friendship with Viriathus, they made their way unobserved into his tent by night, and having dispatched him with well-aimed strokes of the sword, rushed at once from the camp, and by keeping to trackless mountain country, escaped safely to Capio. 218. They accorded the body of Viriathus a marvellous and resplendent burial, and by the tomb, in honour of his far-famed courage, held funeral games in which 200 pairs of gladiators participated. By common consent, he was a most valiant fighter in battle, and a most able general in foreseeing what would be advantageous. Most important of all, throughout his entire career as a general, he commanded the devotion of his troops to a degree unequalled by anyone. In the distribution of booty, he took no more than the share apportioned to the common soldiers, and from what was assigned to him, he rewarded the soldiers who merited thanks and succored those who were in need. He was sober, tireless, and alert to every difficulty and danger, and he was superior to every pleasure. The proofs of his ability are manifest, for in the 11 years that he commanded the Lusitanians, his troops not only remained free of dissension, but were all but invincible, whereas after his death the confederacy of the Lusitanians disintegrated. Once it was deprived of his leadership. 22. Ptolemy, because of his cruelty and thirst for blood, and because of his unabashed enjoyment of the most shameful pleasures and his gross physical deformity, whence his nickname Pot-belly. But his general, Hierax, being a man of extraordinary talent in the arts of war, and having a gift for dealing with crowds, besides being open-hearted, held together the kingdom of Ptolemy. Thus, when Ptolemy's funds were low, and the soldiers were inclined to go over to Galaestes because they were not paid, by providing for the army from his private purse, he brought the movement to an end. 23. The Egyptians utterly despised Ptolemy, for they saw that he was childish in dealing with people, that he had abandoned himself to the most shameful pleasures, and that he had grown physically effeminate through self-indulgence. 24. The city known as Contobri sent envoys to the Romans, who, in accordance with their instructions, ordered the Romans to quit the region with all possible speed before some disaster befell them, inasmuch as all others who had had the temerity to invade those areas with a hostile army had perished to a man. The consul replied that though the Lusitanians and Celtiberians were much given to great threats and encroachments, the Romans made it their practice to punish wrongdoers and to disregard threats. Accordingly, it would become them to demonstrate their valor, not with threats, but with actions, and indeed their valor would be put to the most precise test. 25. He considered it better for them to fight and meet death gloriously than to submit their persons, stripped of arms, to a most shameful slavery. 26. Iunius too exhorted his soldiers now, if ever, to acquit them like men and to show themselves worthy of their former successes. Nay, nevertheless, their hearts did not falter, for the power of reason prevailed over their physical weakness. Word was spread abroad of the inexorable vengeance of the Romans on those who opposed them, and of their outstandingly fair treatment of those who obeyed their command. 27. The consul Aemilius IV was ineffectual in the pursuits of war because of his physical bulk and lack of agility, what with his excess of weight and his great rolls of flesh. 28. In Syria Diodotus, surnamed Tryphon, having murdered Antiochus, the son of Alexander, a mere child who was being reared as one destined to the throne, put on his own head the royal diadem, and having seized the vacant throne, proclaimed himself monarch and engaged in war on the satraps and generals of the legitimate king. For in Mesopotamia there was Dionysius the Mede, in Coele Syria Sarpedon and Palamedes, and in Seleucia Bythesia Eschrion, who had with him Queen Cleopatra, the wife of Demetrius, whom Arsaces had taken captive. 20. Tryphon, having risen from private estate to the kingship, was eager to strengthen his position by means of a senatorial decree. Accordingly, having prepared a golden statue of victory, of the weight of 10,000 gold staters, he dispatched envoys to Rome to convey it to the Roman people, for he supposed that the Romans would accept the victory, both because of its value and as an object of good omen, and would acclaim him as king. But he found that the senators were more cunning than himself, and that they shrewdly outmaneuvered those who sought to mislead and deceive them. For the Senate accepted the gift and secured the good omen together with the prophet, but changed the attribution of the gift and in Tryphon's stead inscribed it with the name of the king whom he had assassinated. By this act, the Senate went on record as condemning the murder of the boy and as refusing the gifts of impious men. Scipio Africanus I and his fellow ambassadors came to Alexandria to survey the entire kingdom. Ptolemy welcomed the men with a great reception and much pomp, held costly banquets for them, and conducting them about, showed them his palace and other royal treasures. Now the Roman envoys were men of superior virtue, and since their normal diet was limited to a few dishes, and only such as were conducive to health, they were scornful of his extravagance as detrimental to both body and mind. The spectacle of all that the king considered marvelous they regarded as a sideshow of no real account, but busied themselves in detail with what was truly worth seeing, the situation and strength of the city, the unique features of the pharaohs. Then, proceeding up the river to Memphis, the quality of the land and the blessings brought to it by the Nile, the great number of Egyptian cities and the untold myriads of their inhabitants, the strong defensive position of Egypt, and the general excellence of the country, in that it is well suited to provide for the security and greatness of an empire. And when they had marveled at the number of the inhabitants of Egypt and the natural advantages of its terrain, they apprehended that a very great power could be built there if this kingdom should ever find rulers worthy of it. Having surveyed Egypt, the envoys embarked for Cyprus, and thence for Syria. In sum, they traversed the greater part of the inhabited world, and on all sides, since they conducted their visit in sober fashion, worthy of wonder, they received a warm welcome, and returned home with plaudits in which all concurred. For where there were parties in dispute, some they had reconciled one to the other, some they had persuaded to do justice to those who had brought complaint, some who could not be abashed they had put under restraint, and those whose cases admitted of no easy decision they had referred to the Senate. They had had dealings with kings and with popular governments, and by renewing the existing ties of friendship with one and all had enhanced, in terms of goodwill, the leadership of Rome. As a result, all, having now been won over to a friendly attitude, one dispatched embassies to Rome and expressed appreciation that the Romans had sent out men of this stamp. When King Antiochus, says Diodorus, was laying siege to Jerusalem, the Jews held out for a time, but when all their supplies were exhausted, they found themselves compelled to make overtures for a cessation of hostility. Now the majority of his friends advised the king to take the city by storm and to wipe out completely the race of Jews, since they alone of all nations avoided dealings with any other people and looked upon all men as their enemy. They pointed out, too, that the ancestors of the Jews had been driven out of all Egypt as men who were impious and detested by the gods. For by way of purging the country, all persons who had white or leprous marks on their bodies had been assembled and driven across the border, as being under a curse. The refugees had occupied the territory round about Jerusalem, and having organized the nation of the Jews, had made their hatred of mankind into a tradition, and on this account had introduced utterly outlandish laws, not to break bread with any other race, nor to show them any goodwill at all. His friends reminded Antiochus also of the enmity that in times past his ancestors had felt for this people. Antiochus, called Epiphanes, on defeating the Jews, had entered the innermost sanctuary of the god's temple, where it was lawful for the priest alone to enter. Finding there a marble statue of a heavily bearded man seated on an ass, with a book in his hands, he supposed it to be an image of Moses, the founder of Jerusalem and organizer of the nation, the man, moreover, who had ordained for the Jews their misanthropic and lawless custom. And since Epiphanes was shocked by such hatred directed against all mankind, he had set himself to break down their traditional practices. Accordingly, he sacrificed before the image of the founder and the open-air altar of the god a great sow, and poured its blood over them. Then, having prepared its flesh, he ordered that their holy books containing the xenophobic laws should be sprinkled with the broth of the meat, that the lamp, which they call undying and which burns continually in the temple, should be extinguished, and that the high priest and the rest of the Jews should be compelled to partake of the meat. Rehearsing all these events, his friends strongly urged Antiochus to make an end of the race completely, or, failing that, to abolish their laws and force them to change their ways. But the king, being a magnanimous and mild-mannered person, took hostages, but dismissed the charges against the Jews, once he had exacted the tribute that was due and had dismantled the walls of Jerusalem. When Sicily, after the Carthaginian collapse, had enjoyed 60 years of good fortune in all respects, the Servile War broke out for the following reason. The Sicilians, having shot up in prosperity and acquired great wealth, began to purchase a vast number of slaves, to whose bodies, as they were brought in droves from the slave markets, they at once applied marks and brands. The young men they used as cowherds, the others in such ways as they happened to be useful, but they treated them with a heavy hand in their service, and granted them the most meagre care, the bare minimum for food and clothing. As a result, most of them made their livelihood by brigandage, and there was bloodshed everywhere, since the brigands were like scattered bands of soldiers. The governors, praetores, attempted to repress them, but since they did not dare to punish them because of the power and prestige of the gentry who owned the brigands, they were forced to connive at the pillaging of the province. For most of the landowners were Roman knights, equites, and since it was the knights who acted as judges when charges arising from provincial affairs were brought against the governors, the magistrates stood in awe of them. The slaves, distressed by their hardships and frequently outraged and beaten beyond all reason, could not endure their treatment. Getting together as opportunity offered, they discussed the possibility of revolt until at last they put their plans into action. There was a certain Syrian slave belonging to Antigenes of Enna. He was an Apamean by birth and had an aptitude for magic and the working of wonders. He claimed to foretell the future by divine command through dreams, and because of his talent along these lines deceived many. Going on from there, he not only gave oracles by means of dreams, but even made a pretense of having waking visions of the gods and of hearing the future from their own lips. Of his many improvisations, some by chance turned out true, and since those which failed to do so were left unchallenged, while those that were fulfilled attracted attention, his reputation advanced apace. Finally, through some device, while in a state of divine possession, he would produce fire and flame from his mouth, and thus rave oracularly about things to come. Or he would place fire and fuel to maintain it in a nut, or something similar, that was pierced on both sides. Then, placing it in his mouth and blowing on it, he kindled now sparks, and now a flame. Prior to the revolt, he used to say that the Syrian goddess appeared to him, saying that he should be king, and he repeated this, not only to others, but even to his own master. Since his claims were treated as a joke, Antigenes, taken by his hocus-pocus, would introduce Eunice, for that was the wonder-worker's name, at his dinner parties and cross-question him about his kingship and how he would treat each of the men present. And since he gave a full account of everything without hesitation, explaining with what moderation he would treat the masters and in some making a colourful tale of his quackery, the guests were always stirred to laughter, and some of them, picking up a nice tidbit from the table, would present it to him, adding, as they did so, that when he became king he should remember the favour. But, as it happened, his charlatanism did in fact result in kingship, and for the favours received in jest at the banquets he made a return of thanks in good earnest. The beginning of the whole revolt took place as follows. There was a certain Damophilus of Enna, a man of great wealth, but insolent of manner. He had abused his slaves to excess, and his wife Megalis vied even with her husband in punishing the slaves and in her general inhumanity towards them. The slaves, reduced by this degrading treatment to the level of brutes, conspired to revolt and to murder their masters. Going to Eunice, they asked him whether their resolve had the favour of the gods. He, resorting to his usual mummery, promised them the favour of the gods, and soon persuaded them to act at once. Immediately, therefore, they brought together 400 of their fellow slaves, and, having armed themselves in such ways as opportunity permitted, they fell upon the city of Enna, with Eunice at their head and working his miracle of the flames of fire for their benefit. When they found their way into the houses, they shed much blood, sparing not even suckling babes. Rather, they tore them from the breast and dashed them to the ground, while, as for the women, and under their husbands' very eyes, but words cannot tell the extent of their outrages and acts of lewdness. By now, a great multitude of slaves from the city had joined them, who, after first demonstrating against their own masters their utter ruthlessness, then turned to the slaughter of others. When Eunice and his men learned that Demophilus and his wife were in the garden that lay near the city, they sent some of their band and dragged them off, both the man and his wife, fettered and with hands bound behind their backs, subjecting them to many outrages along the way. Only in the case of the couple's daughter were the slaves seen to show consideration throughout, and this was because of her kindly nature, in that, to the extent of her power, she was always compassionate and ready to succor the slaves. Thereby, it was demonstrated that the others were treated as they were, not because of some natural savagery of slaves, but rather in revenge for wrongs previously received. The men appointed to the task, having dragged Demophilus and Megallus into the city, as we said, brought them to the theatre, where the crowd of rebels had assembled. But when Demophilus attempted to devise a plea to get them off safe and was winning over many of the crowd with his words, Hermias and Zeuxis, men bitterly disposed towards him, denounced him as a cheat, and without waiting for a formal trial by the assembly, the one ran him through the chest with a sword, the other chopped off his head with an axe. Thereupon, Funes was chosen king, not for his manly courage or his ability as a military leader, but solely for his marvels and his setting of the revolt in motion, and because his name seemed to contain a favorable omen that suggested goodwill towards his subjects. Established as the rebels' supreme commander, he called an assembly and put to death all the citizenry of Enna, except for those who were skilled in the manufacture of arms. These he put in chains and assigned them to this task. He gave Megallus to the maidservants to deal with as they might wish. They subjected her to torture and threw her over a precipice. He himself murdered his own masters, Antigenes and Pytho. Having set a diadem upon his head and arrayed himself in full royal style, he proclaimed his wife queen. She was a fellow Syrian and of the same city, and appointed to the royal council such men as seemed to be gifted with superior intelligence, among them one Achaeus by name and an Achaean by birth, a man who excelled both at planning and in action. In 3 days, Eunice had armed, as best he could, more than 6,000 men, besides others in his train who had only axes and hatchets or slings or sickles or fire-hardened stakes or even kitchen spits, and he went about ravaging the countryside. Then, since he kept recruiting untold numbers of slaves, he ventured even to do battle with Roman generals, and on joining combat repeatedly, overcame them with his superior numbers, for he now had more than 10,000 soldiers. Meanwhile, a man named Cleon, a Cilician, began a revolt of still other slaves. And though there were high hopes everywhere that the revolutionary groups would come into conflict one with the other, and that the rebels, by destroying themselves, would free Sicily of strife, contrary to expectations the two groups joined forces, Cleon, having subordinated himself to Eunice at his mere command, and discharging, as it were, the function of a general serving a king, his particular band numbered 5,000 men. It was now about 30 days since the outbreak. Soon after, engaging in battle with a general arrived from Rome, Lucius Hypsæus, who had 8,000 Sicilian troops, the rebels were victorious, since they now numbered 20,000. Before long, their band reached a total of 200,000, and in numerous battles with the Romans they acquitted themselves well, and failed but seldom. As word of this was bruited about, a revolt of 150 slaves, banded together, flared up in Rome, of more than 1,000 in Attica, and of yet others in Delos and many other places. But thanks to the speed with which forces were brought up, and to the severity of their punitive measures, the magistrates of these communities at once disposed of the rebels, and brought to their senses any who were wavering on the verge of revolt. In Sicily, however, the trouble grew. Cities were captured with all their inhabitants, and many armies were cut to pieces by the rebels, until Rupilius, the Roman commander, recovered Tauromenium for the Romans by placing it under strict siege and confining the rebels under conditions of unspeakable duress and famine, conditions such that, beginning by eating the children, they progressed to the women and did not altogether abstain even from eating one another. It was on this occasion that Rupilius captured Commanus, the brother of Cleon, as he was attempting to escape from the beleaguered city. Finally, after Serapion, a Syrian, had betrayed the citadel, the general laid hands on all the runaway slaves in the city, whom, after torture, he threw over a cliff. From there, he advanced to Enna, which he put under siege in much the same manner, bringing the rebels into extreme straits and frustrating their hopes. Cleon came forth from the city with a few men, But after an heroic struggle, covered with wounds, he was displayed dead, and Rupilius captured this city also by betrayal, since its strength was impregnable to force of arm. Eunice, taking with him his bodyguards, 1,000 strong, fled in unmanly fashion to a certain precipitous region. The men with him, however, aware that their dreaded fate was inevitable, inasmuch as the general, Rupilius, was already marching against them, killed one another with the sword by beheading. Eunice, the wonder-worker and king, who, through cowardice, had sought refuge in certain caves, was dragged out with 4 others, a cook, a baker, the man who massaged him at his bath, and a 4th, whose duty it had been to amuse him at drinking party. Remanded to prison, where his flesh disintegrated into a mass of lice, he met such an end as befitted his knavery, and died at Morgantina. Thereupon Rupilius, traversing the whole of Sicily with a few picked troops, sooner than had been expected, rid it of every nest of robbers. Eunice, king of the rebels, called himself Antiochus, and his horde of rebel Syrians. There was never a sedition of slaves so great as that which occurred in Sicily, whereby many cities met with grave calamities. Innumerable men and women, together with their children, experienced the greatest misfortunes, and all the island was in danger of falling into the power of fugitive slaves, who measured their authority only by the excessive suffering of the freeborn. To most people, these events came as an unexpected and sudden surprise, but to those who were capable of judging affairs, realistically, they did not seem to happen without reason. Because of the superabundant prosperity of those who exploited the products of this mighty island, nearly all who had risen in wealth affected first a luxurious mode of living, then arrogance and insolence. As a result of all this, since both the maltreatment of the slaves and their estrangement from their masters increased at an equal rate, there was at last, when occasion offered, a violent outburst of hatred. So without a word of summons, tens of thousands of slaves joined forces to destroy their masters. Similar events took place throughout Asia at the same period, after Aristonicus one laid claim to a kingdom that was not rightfully his, and the slaves, because of their owners' maltreatment of them, joined him in his mad venture and involved many cities in great misfortune. In like fashion, each of the large landowners bought up whole slave marts to work their lands, to bind some in fetters, to wear out others by the severity of their tasks, and they marked all with their arrogant brands. In consequence, so great a multitude of slaves inundated all Sicily that those who heard tell of the immense number were incredulous. For in fact, the Sicilians who had acquired much wealth were now rivaling the Italians in arrogance, greed, and villainy. And the Italians who owned large numbers of slaves had made crime so familiar to their herdsmen that they provided them no food but permitted them to plunder, with such license given to men who had the physical strength to accomplish their every resolve, who had scope and leisure to seize the opportunity, and who for want of food were constrained to embark on perilous enterprises. There was soon an increase in lawlessness. They began by murdering men who were travelling singly or in pairs, in the most conspicuous areas. Then they took to assaulting in a body, by night, the homesteads of the less well protected, which they destroyed, seizing the property and killing all who resisted. As their boldness grew steadily greater, Sicily became impassable to travellers by night. Those who normally lived in the country found it no longer safe to stay there, and there was violence, robbery, and all manner of bloodshed on every side. The herdsmen, however, because of their experience of life in the open and their military accoutrements, were naturally all brimming with high spirits and audacity, and since they carried clubs or spears or stout staves, while their bodies were protected by the skins of wolves or wild boars, they presented a terrifying appearance that was little short of actual belligerency. Moreover, each had at his heels a pack of valiant dogs, while the plentiful diet of milk and meat available to the men rendered them savage in temper and in physique. So every region was filled with what were practically scattered bands of soldiers, since, with the permission of their masters, the reckless daring of the slaves had been furnished with arms. The praetors attempted to hold the raging slaves in check, but not daring to punish them because of the power and influence of the masters, were forced to wink at the plundering of their province. For most of the landowners were Roman knights in full standing, and since it was the knights who acted as judges when charges arising from provincial affairs were brought against the governors, the magistrates stood in awe of them. The Italians who were engaged in agriculture purchased great numbers of slaves, all of whom they marked with brands, but failed to provide them sufficient food, and by oppressive toil wore them out. Not only in the exercise of political power should men of prominence be considerate towards those of low estate, but so also in private life they should, if they are sensible, treat their slaves gently. For heavy-handed arrogance leads states into civil strife and factionalism between citizens, and in individual households it paves the way for plots of slaves against masters and for terrible uprisings in concert against the whole state. The more power is perverted to cruelty and lawlessness, the more the character of those subject to that power is brutalized to the point of desperation. Anyone whom fortune has set in low estate willingly yields place to his superiors in point of gentility and esteem, but if he is deprived of due consideration, he comes to regard those who harshly lord it over him with bitter enmity. There, 5 was a certain Damophilus, a native of Enna, a man of great wealth but arrogant in manner, who, since he had under cultivation a great circuit of land and owned many herds of cattle, emulated not only the luxury affected by the Italian landowners in Sicily, but also their troops of slaves and their inhumanity and severity towards them. He drove about the countryside with expensive horses, 4-wheeled carriages, and a bodyguard of slaves, and prided himself, in addition, on his great train of handsome serving boys and ill-mannered parasites. Both in town and at his villas he took pains to provide a veritable exhibition of embossed silver and costly crimson spreads, and had himself served sumptuous and regally lavish dinners, in which he surpassed even the luxury of the Persians in outlay and extravagance, as indeed he outdid them also in arrogance. His uncouth and boorish nature, in fact, being set in possession of irresponsible power and in control of a vast fortune, first of all engendered satiety, then overweening pride, and, at last, destruction for him and great calamities for his country. Purchasing a large number of slaves, he treated them outrageously, marking with branding irons the bodies of men who in their own countries had been free, but who, through capture and war, had come to know the fate of a slave. Some of these he put in fetters and thrust into slave pens. Others he designated to act as his herdsmen, but neglected to provide them with suitable clothing or food. On one occasion, when approached by a group of naked domestics with a request for clothing, Damophilus of Enna impatiently refused to listen. What? He said, do those who travel through the country go naked? Do they not offer a ready source of supply for anyone who needs garments? Having said this, he ordered them bound to pillars, piled blows on them, and arrogantly dismissed them. Because of his arbitrary and savage humor, not a day passed that this same Damophilus did not torment some of his slaves without just cause. His wife, Metalis, who delighted no less in these arrogant punishments, treated her maidservants cruelly, as well as any other slaves who fell into her clutches. And because of the despiteful punishments received from them both, the slaves were filled with rage against their masters, and conceiving that they could encounter nothing worse than their present misfortunes, too began to form conspiracies to revolt and to murder their masters. Approaching Eunice, who lived not far away, they asked whether their project had the approval of the gods. He put on a display of his inspired transports, and when he learned why they had come, stated clearly that the gods favored their revolt, provided they made no delay but applied themselves to the enterprise at once. For it was decreed by fate that Enna, the citadel of the whole island, should be their land. Having heard this, and believing that Providence was assisting them in their project, they were so keenly wrought up for revolt that there was no delay in executing their resolve. At once, therefore, they set free those in bonds, and collecting such of the others as lived nearby, they assembled about 400 men at a certain field not far from Enna. After making a compact and exchanging pledges sworn by night over sacrificial victims, they armed themselves in such fashion as the occasion allowed, but all were equipped with the best of weapons, fury, which was bent on the destruction of their arrogant masters. Their leader was Eunice. With cries of encouragement to one another, they broke into the city about midnight and put many to the sword. There was in Sicily a daughter of Damophilus, a girl of marriageable age, remarkable for her simplicity of manner and her kindness of heart. It was always her practice to do all she could to comfort the slaves who were beaten by her parents, and since she also took the part of any who had been put in bonds, she was wondrously loved by one and all for her kindness. So now, at this time, once since her past favours enlisted in her service the mercy of those to whom she had shown kindness, no one was so bold as to lay violent hands upon the girl, but all maintained her fresh young beauty inviolate, and selecting suitable men from their number, among them Hermias, her warmest champion, they escorted her to the home of certain kinsmen in Catana. Although the rebellious slaves were enraged against the whole household of their masters and resorted to unrelenting abuse and vengeance, there were yet some indications that it was not from innate savagery, but rather because of the arrogant treatment they had themselves received that they now ran amok when they turned to avenge themselves on their persecutor. Even among slaves, human nature needs no instructor in regard to a just repayment, whether of gratitude or of revenge. Eunice, after being proclaimed king, put them all to death, except for the men who, in times past had, when his master indulged him, admitted him to their banquets, and had shown him courtesy both in respect of his prophecies and in their gifts of good things from the table. These men he spirited away and set free. Here, indeed, was cause for astonishment, that their fortunes should be so dramatically reversed, and that a kindness in such trivial matters should be requited so opportunely and with so great a boon. Achaeus, the counsellor of King Antiochus, being far from pleased at the conduct of the runaway slaves, censured them for their recklessness and boldly warned them that they would meet with speedy punishment. So far from putting him to death for his outspokenness, Eunice not only presented him with the house of his former masters, but made him a royal counsellor. There was, in addition, another revolt of fugitive slaves who banded together in considerable numbers. A certain Cleon, a Cilician from the region about Taurus, who was accustomed from childhood to a life of brigandage and had become in Sicily a herder of horses, constantly waylaid travellers and perpetrated murders of all kinds. On hearing the news of Eunice's success and of the victories of the fugitives serving with him, he rose in revolt, and persuading some of the slaves nearby to join him in his mad venture, overran the city of Acragas and all the surrounding country. Their pressing needs and their poverty forced the rebel slaves to regard everyone as acceptable, giving them no opportunity to pick and choose. It needed no portent from the heavens to realize how easily the city could be captured. For it was evident even to the most simple-minded that because of the long period of peace, the walls had crumbled, and that now, when many of its soldiers had been killed, the siege of the city would bring an easy success.